Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, bringing together prominent New Yorkers with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Organized labor is at a crossroads in this nation, and especially in this city, which was built throughout the 20th century by the muscles and skills of union members. As the workforce shifts towards the service and technology sectors, union officials are working hard, with mixed success, to bring these modern workers into the labor fold. But even a weakened labor force retains immense political power, as evidenced by the wooing of labor leaders by Democratic presidential candidates and the uproar that ensued after City Council Education Committee Chairwoman Eva Moskowitz held widely covered hearings into contract work rules in the city schools. City managers call those rules hyper-technical and onerous. Are unions all the more essential now as we enter a technological era when so many of us are reduced to electronically expressed numerical values? Or have unions run their course as younger workers and immigrants and those who are emerging and have not had the experience of struggling to create them see them as just one more quasi-governmental impediment? We're joined by four prominent New Yorkers to take the pulse of the union movement in the city today. Joshua Freeman is professor of history at the City University Graduate Center, specializing in labor issues. Ness is professor of political science and labor specialist at Brooklyn College, my alma mater. Richard Steier is a longtime journalistic observer of labor affairs, and he is the editor of the Chief Leader, the city's independent civil service newspaper. And Saru Jayaraman is the executive director of the Restaurant Opportunity Center of New York, which works to improve working conditions for restaurant workers and was born out of the ashes of the attack on the World Trade Center to help the surviving workers from windows on the world. Let me start with you, Professor Freeman. In the city council hearings, you had these intense denunciations of those hearings by labor leaders, Brian McLaughlin, the head of the Central Labor Council, as well as the school unions. Do those denunciations indicate their strength or their weakness?
Oh, I don't think you should make too much of this whole thing. The custodians union and the UFT work rules have been favorite targets for politicians for decades, and they act outraged, and then labor acts outraged that they've been attacked. So this is a somewhat ritualistic set of events we've seen. I think it's certainly true that nationally labor's been in a crisis for quite some time, but I think that particular set of events probably has more to do with the politics of education between the city council and the mayor than really any sustained attack on trade unionism.
Ness. It seems to me that the labor movement is at somewhat of a low ebb historically. You even saw the Daily News, which was traditionally the paper of the working people. You had a columnist say that one of the problems with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority is that it failed to break the Transport Workers Union in the last contract. What's going on?
Well, I beg to disagree that the labor movement is at a low ebb. I think that labor recognizes very clearly who they need to organize. Some of the unions are strategically organizing segments of the labor force that are more amenable to organizing, and that means service workers, custodial workers, restaurant workers, healthcare workers, and they're doing a good job at it. The whole question is how many unions are actually engaged in this, and what the AFL-CIO needs to do, as well as New York unions, is to more strategically engage in organizing. It's also extremely important for them to reach out to various communities of immigrant workers and new working class members who are forming their own associations, and this is a critical issue. But I would argue that they're not at a low ebb. I would argue that they are trying their best.
Saru, he's talking about workers forming workers' associations. That's exactly what you've been involved in, and you've been working with a lot of immigrant workers, a lot of people who are, as we would define them, as the powerless of the city, and trying to develop some kind of collective strength. Has the labor movement been helpful? Has it been an obstacle?
Well, I think immigrant workers in general, immigrants come in large part from countries that have been really attacked by U.S. imperialism over the last, decades, are coming into this new service economy and frankly are feeling extremely disillusioned with the labor movement, don't trust it at all, frankly. And I think that's why there's been this incredible emergence of worker centers all over the city over the last 20 years. at least 25 worker centers now exist focusing on specific immigrant communities and really organizing workers at the grassroots level in ways that unions really have not been able to. I mean, these are, you know, either job sectors or groups of immigrants that unions just don't have the capacity to reach out to or are not willing to reach out to. And so worker centers have really emerged in that void. And you know, it's unfortunate because I do think that labor movement could benefit from working together with these worker centers and learn from them, but on the contrary, they've really sort of disrespected them, looked down on them. There's a real hostile relationship right now between worker centers in New York City and the labor movement, so it's really unfortunate.
Mr. Steier, who are the key labor leaders in the city today?
At this point, I think that among those who you would count as key labor leaders are people who have established themselves for more than a dozen years, like Dennis Rivera of the Hospital Workers Union, who's increasingly becoming a power not just in city politics, but statewide as well. I think
Nationally.
to some extent, yes. Randy Weingarten of the United Federation of Teachers, both in her role representing teachers and also as a spokesman for the municipal unions as head of the Municipal Labor Committee. I think that Roger Toussaint, assuming that he wins the election that's going on right now, is going to continue to consolidate his strength at the Transport Workers Union and is going to be a major player in the political scene in years to come. I think that to some degree Brian McLaughlin, as head of the AFL-CIO Central Labor Council, serves as a spokesman for trades workers in the city as well as for the larger labor movement, and because he's also a Democratic Assemblyman from Queens, he has his foot into the political sphere where he's not merely a supplicant going to Albany. He's a guy who's actually one of the power brokers in the state.
Manny, let me pick up something that Saru said that you also referred to. I mean, she's talking about some of these worker groups that are not going through a traditional union process. You know, maybe they want to break into that union process, but either, I mean, have the unions not been welcoming? Has it been a failure on their part?
I would say that I'd say workers organize themselves in every workplace, that there are networks of workers, immigrant, native-born, etc., that are organized in some way or another. New York represents an exception, and I know Josh, his book really tells the story of the exception of the small and dispersed kind of industry that New York City developed over the years. They are very hard to organize. It's hard to organize shop by shop, and as Saru pointed out, a lot of unions do not have the capacity to do so, and there is where perhaps workers' centers come in. But I think New York is an exceptional city, not to say that they're better, although we could say that it's a working class town, as Josh would say, but that it's extremely hard to organize these workers who are employed throughout the city in a way that's formulaic, as many of the national unions are trying. I mean, there are several really important efforts. 32BJ is an example, HERE and so forth. They're trying, and they're tapping into actual workers' organizations that are existent in these shops. The question is whether workers will ultimately trust the union to defend their interests and give them a certain degree of democracy and autonomy to run their affairs. And I think there's a high degree of cynicism. I agree with Saru there. And I also think that unions may not be interested in organizing 2/3 of the workers who represent the national workforce, who are employed in small shops. It's not just New York.
Yeah, I would say it goes beyond capacity because there are whole new industries developing in this service economy. And I'll give you the example of day laborers. Day laborers are now growing by the thousands all over the city. And unions, for the most part, have really looked the other way. There really is no union effort to organize day laborers in the city. And I think the whole growth of the contingent workforce all over, because of the service economy, you know, is unfortunate that the traditional labor movement doesn't look to those new changes in the economy and say, look, we need to change our strategy because things are changing in the economy. Instead, they stick with their traditional roots, and that's where the worker centers really have to figure out new strategies, innovative models to organize these industries.
You know, I don't disagree at all, but I think one of the issues that labor, in either form, as worker centers or unions, because they're both labor, has to face, is that we have a structure of labor law that's built on a model which in many cases is not the model of the growing economy. So that, for example, temporary employment agencies really are almost impossible to organize under the structure of current labor law, because the employer nominally is the temp agency, but in fact it's really the person the temp agency is selling the services to. But efforts to try to organize within the NLRB framework have been pretty unsuccessful. So you have a sort of set of problems piling on top of one another, and one is the fact that we have a set of labor laws that do not protect worker rights.
That's precisely why we need to think about policy initiatives. We need to think about changing the law. And the worker centers, frankly, have sort of been at the forefront of that. The Domestic Workers United bill that just passed in City Council did attack temp agencies' tendency to place domestic workers in placements where people are not even paid the minimum wage or treated with decent, human dignity. And now they're going to the state level to actually add to pass a bill at the state level that would give domestic workers the right to organize, because domestic workers are outside of the NLRB context. It would be the first bill in the country to give these kinds of independent workers the right to organize. So I think unions need to learn from these kinds of initiatives. Policy initiatives are being developed all over the place by sort of innovative grassroots efforts.
I mean, Richie, it seems that the largest unions right now, outside perhaps 1199, which is the hospital, which is largely the private hospital industry and private nursing industry, are in fact municipal unions, government unions, who have not had a very good time negotiating raises, benefit increases. They're in a state of give back. Do you get? Are they in a weakened political position, and how does that play out?
They're not necessarily in a state of give back. It's something Bloomberg is looking for give backs. The unions aren't giving him what he wants. They're getting beaten up to a certain extent in the dailies, particularly the two loud tabloids, the Post and the Daily News, for failing to do so. But if the unions did what those newspapers wanted, they would be abrogating their duty to their members, that you are not in a situation. They represent people who did not make out royally during the good times of the late 1990s. In most cases, they were locked into contracts that included 2-year wage freezes at the beginning. And so that the mood of the members is not such where they're going to abide by give-back contracts. Now the question becomes, how long will Bloomberg be able to hold out and decide that he doesn't need any union support when he runs again, that he doesn't worry if there's any labor unrest because he doesn't have any contracts in place by the time that he's running for re-election. It could be that, unlike most mayoral candidates who at some point have to make peace with the unions, he's just going to be able to run on his bankroll and figure that he can win much the way that he did in 2001. But the circumstances are not going to work to his advantage, I think, the way that they did back in 2001. You're not going to have that unique confluence of the aftermath of 9/11 combined with the Democratic Party beating itself up that allowed him to win a couple of years ago.
In a time of economic hard times, economic difficult times, is it harder for unions to go out and organize when they have to spend so much energy trying to protect what they have?
Well, from the organizing point of view, very roughly, you tend to find it easier to organize in actually more prosperous times because people are less scared of losing their job, and of course, people often get fired in their efforts to organize unions. So in the private sector, generally speaking, it's actually when you have a lower unemployment rate, the organizing becomes easier, which is a little bit against your instinct because you think just sort of being miserable would lead to organization. But people often get scared and timid for pretty decent reasons. In the municipal union sector is a little different because you don't tend to have the viciousness of anti-union sentiment and efforts to stop organizing. So they may play out a little differently there.
It's because of the political role the unions play within the
because of the political
process.
role, and because the managers are not coming out of a culture which maximizing profit is necessarily the main thing. They don't like unions, but one of the distinctions of America compared to most other industrialized countries is just how vehement and determined American business is to stop unions. And I don't think you see that in quite the same way in the public sector here as you do in the private sector.
What about the relationship between higher unemployment and a more difficult time organizing?
Well, I do agree with what Josh said. It's clear that higher unemployment makes it harder to organize because you have more people looking for jobs. And
Yet the
as a
labor movement's
consequence-
greatest move ahead, especially in the industrial unions, happened at the time of highest unemployment in the history of the country in the 1930s.
Well, I think that if we were to analyze the 30s, we really have to look more historically into the 40s and so forth, when after the war there was the greatest upsurge of labor organizing during a period of relative prosperity, and that organizing actually built the labor movement we have today. I actually think it's a combination of factors. I think immiseration does have some effect, particularly on immigrant workers. I mean, you go back to look at the garment workers. They organized themselves at the beginning of the century. Or the mine workers, they organized themselves under incredibly horrific circumstances. So I think one has to look individually at each labor market, each institution, and I would say that the more workers are isolated in some ways, the more they may be prone to organize. And if you look back once again at the garment worker organizing that was the base of the manufacturing industry in New York City, these are workers who did not emerge from unions. They built their unions.
Well, but when you talk about workers being in isolation, I think the question of day laborers, of cab drivers, the cab drivers union collapsed, home health care workers, people who don't, as you technologically advance in the computer age, a central workplace is not as essential and isn't really the model quite so much as it used to be. And so how do you it's that much harder to organize on the one hand because you got to go out to where people are working and they don't have a central place where you do it by mail.
Right. That's been the opposite experience for us. I mean, definitely coming back to the issue of unemployment, I agree that, in the restaurant industry, which is where I currently organize, definitely there's been a chill on organizing, particularly for immigrant workers. The fear not just of losing their jobs, but post 9/11 of being detained, deported, racially profiled, you name it. So there's all kinds of fears involved. However, 13,000 restaurant workers lost their jobs after 9/11, 300 at Windows on the World. We were able to build a center out of that unemployment. We were able to build a movement out of that unemployment.
But not through Local 100.
No, independently.
Not through,
we created
not through the restaurant local.
Right, we created a center, which is exactly what you're talking about, a place where people from different workplaces and unemployed people and isolated restaurant workers and, Alex from Joe's pub down the street who has 2 or 3 employees could come together and organize a labor movement in a very different way.
But did you use that, do you use ROC as a hiring hall?
Yeah, we did. We did a combination. We would actually do job placements where we would negotiate for better wages with the placement, with the restaurant, and at the same time we would be organizing people in existing restaurants for better wages, better working conditions, and at the same time we're actually organizing a group of displaced workers from Windows to open their own cooperatively owned restaurant.
So why would a restaurant want to go? Restaurant owner, which is again a very diverse business. It's it's not a massive, we're not talking about massive chains of restaurants. Why would they want to put up with the hassle, if you will, of going through ROC or going through a union
negotiating
restaurant?
with us? Because they have to. We're out in front of their restaurant every day protesting. We've got lawsuits against them in federal court. One way or the other, they're going to have to deal with us. And our attitude is, look, we want to organize this industry. We want to build power for workers in this industry. Right now, only 1% of all restaurant workers in New York City are union. Only 1%. That means 99% of the industry has nothing. And we got to build power one way or the other. Either it's through HERE or it's through ROC. But employers have to deal with one of us. It's between rock and a hard place, basically.
One of the fascinating things to me about this is that in some ways it really is very much in the tradition of the construction trades and some of the old AFL unions, where workers didn't identify with their employer but with their craft. They weren't, employed by such and such contracting agency, but I'm a carpenter, I'm a chef, or I'm a waitress, and there is that tradition in American labor history. And in some ways, I think, with the shifts in the economy, we need to re-look at that and not simply get caught up in the kind of industrial union model where we think of people as spending a whole career with a single employer and that's how you reach them. Because outside of the public sector, that's less and less typical of what the American economy is looking at. So I think this is, we're back to the future, whatever the phrase is, in a very creative way.
Yeah.
One of the things, especially in again municipal workers, is you have significant members of management who are organized into unions, which is not the case, I think, in the private sector. Does that work? I mean, you have, in the police department, lieutenants and sergeants. You have captains, all the way up to captains. I mean, does that mess up operational efficiency? I mean, it's kind of a phenomenon that you haven't seen in the private sector.
I doubt you'd hear that argument in the police department. In the fire department, the fire union winds up playing an inordinate role in terms of how the department operates.
Fire officers union.
Yes, yeah. And so that I think that to some extent that's true, that certainly it interferes with management prerogatives in terms of who they can promote to top positions without using a civil service list. There's no question about it. I think you'd get that argument from Schools Chancellor Klein that having principals and assistant principals both under the same union's banner makes it tougher that there's a conflict of interest, or at least there's the worry about a conflict of interest, that principals won't discipline assistant principals for fear that it would antagonize the union that both of them report to. But in practicality, I don't know how often that comes into play.
Is there any organizing going on among other managers in the city? Are we in a situation where the unions are growing in the municipal workforce?
I think that basically anyone who is open for organization, those questions have already been settled, that you've got the last real organizing battle for sort of mid-level administrators who are neither fish nor fowl, neither line employees nor managers, were grouped under the organization of staff analysts over the last decade or so. And so that at this point, I don't know that there's a labor frontier out there in the public sector, that pretty much anybody who comes in is already spoken for in terms of having a union to represent them.
That is not the case in the private sector.
The private sector is illegal in most cases. In 1947, the United States Congress, in its wisdom, made it illegal to organize foremen and many supervisory personnel who were unionizing during World War II in the 40s. And the companies were terrified because these were the sergeants of labor discipline, And if the sergeants are organizing with the privates, the colonels are unhappy. So the Taft-Hartley Act, one of its provisions, makes it illegal to actually organize very, very large categories of supervisory personnel. So,
and that's only going to become worse. Bush is bringing these new overtime law changes that are basically, especially in the restaurant industry and other service sector industries, going to classify a lot of people who previously were workers as supervisors so that they can't benefit from overtime provisions, so that they get annual salaries. So it's only going to get worse.
It seems to me that the holy grail of union membership is health care. That when you think of what can a worker get out of paying his or her dues, health care is probably the primary service that they can get. It's absolutely essential. There's obviously, you have both a move in the government to do some kind of health care, which has always stumbled, and yet you have companies moving to have people pay more for their health care, or in some cases yank health care. Do you agree that that's the holy grail of union benefits?
Well, it depends who you talk to. I think a lot of unions would prefer not to manage health care funds. I know the steelworkers, for one, would prefer to get out of the healthcare management industry and would rather have a universal system of healthcare. And I think
but would they give it over to management?
Well, no. You'd have a state system in which you'd have basic guarantees where all workers wouldn't have to depend on, say, small businesses. This is why it's so hard to organize small businesses. I have to be honest with you, a lot of small businesses can't afford the health plan, especially the good health plans. If the government were able to provide it, you'd have a lot more workers in unions today, because employers perhaps would not be as adamant in opposing organizing drives, because healthcare is taking up a very large share of the wage and benefit package increasingly.
Are you saying that
especially now?
There are organizing drives where management basically threatens to yank health coverage if you, in fact, if you're in a job where you're not organized and you have health care, there are situations in which they say everything goes on the table. So you don't. So if you organize into a union, you're not guaranteed your health care. That now becomes a negotiable item.
Well, I think now that healthcare costs are skyrocketing, it's becoming increasingly difficult for management and workers, because they both contribute in most cases, to pay for these plans. And so I think we are now experiencing a crisis as healthcare costs soar by so many percentages every year, that it's not just management. The system is, I think, currently in a state of crisis.
I think it's
And as a consequence, I think that perhaps more and more people might be interested in systems of universal health care. And you can have private plans too, but you have a lot of organizations that are critical who are suffering because they can't pay health care benefits with respect to the growing rates of coverage for health plans, as well as prescription drugs.
But, I mean, at least since President Truman, we've been talking about national health coverage. We haven't had it yet. I mean, Mrs. Clinton in particular, invested so much of her political capital and came away with nothing to show for it. So talk a little bit about the union role in national politics. I mean, you are seeing, you mentioned Dennis Rivera of Local 1199, who got national attention when he endorsed Howard Dean. Why is labor still labor is both a plum to get and an albatross around your neck in terms of how the Republicans treat that?
Well, I mean, it may be an albatross from that point of view, but that's probably because the Democrats have not had a strong enough message or had enough money to get that message out in terms of explaining who people like Bush and Ronald Reagan were beholden to in terms of special interests. That unions ultimately are supposed to be representing their members. When they're doing their jobs properly, then you shouldn't be looking at labor bosses. You should be looking in terms of what their doing good work means in terms of the average worker. And I'm not just talking about people who belong to unions. When unions gain, it pushes up wages for the entire workforce. That one of the great things that unions tend to do is that non-unionized places, very often they will increase benefits as a way to ward off unions, to keep the unions away from their door, figuring if they make things good enough, if they improve the climate for their workers are not going to want to go through all the aggravation that goes with the union organizing drive. And so that the unions wind up having a positive effect even on people who they don't directly represent.
I think in terms of unions' political strength, it's an odd situation because I think they're both in some ways stronger than ever before, in other ways weaker than ever before. I mean, as a help for a candidate, in some ways they're more useful than ever in American history, and that's why I think you see on the mayoral level and on the national presidential level, candidates want union support because they provide money and they provide real actual people. And besides the evangelical churches, there are very few institutions in American life that actually now can get a person to do something about politics. Unions can actually do that. So they're and they provide phone banks and money and sophisticated advice. On the other hand, their influence on actual policy seems to be almost minimal. So, they play a huge role in mayoral elections, but it makes no difference whatsoever whether their candidates win or lose. And I think you see that on a state level, national level. Dennis Rivera has tremendous political clout. He seems to me to do almost nothing to improve the lives of working people outside of his own union members in New York State. He doesn't have any influence on Joe Bruno or all the other people that he works closely with.
He did on Governor Pataki in the last election.
For his own members' union contract. But once you step away from that, I don't think he's had a whole lot of help, for example, in increasing state minimum wage and revising the workers' compensation system and providing daycare for working people, for providing affordable higher education.
But isn't that what his job is? Isn't his job to first and foremost to take care of his own members? And if it's not, if there's not enough to go around, I'm going to take care of mine.
Well, I don't want to just pick on Dennis Rivera. I think for all union leaders, for example,
I'm not picking on him. I think he did what he's elected to do.
But let's say Union X, their members not only work in their own workplace, but they take subways. Their children go to school. They may want to go to CUNY at night. Their members have lives that are not simply restricted to the workplace. So one conception of unionism is rather broad, that sort of sees the whole life of the members, as relevant. Others tend to look only at the workplace relationship, and I think that latter kind of conception, the narrower conception, has become the norm. And I'm not so sure that's been such a great thing.
Is there some universal involvement that the unions have dropped? I mean, you agree with that point?
Absolutely. I think that there is such a thing as social movement unionism, and then there is such a thing as unionism that's based on the contract. And a lot of unions have in the past supported health care, have supported education, have supported housing programs and so forth. And that as union strength has been diluted as a consequence of not just Republicans, but Democrats as well. I mean, don't forget, labor has been trying to secure or turn back Taft-Hartley for the last 50 or so years, and they failed to, even with Democrats in the White House and in both chambers of the Congress. So what this really means is that unions must be, and they are, much more selective in how they choose their political endorsements. And we also don't have a labor party. A lot of these questions are structural with respect to the United States. We don't have a labor presence on the structural level. We're begging, just like any other organization out there, we're seen as an interest group as opposed to a social movement. And the idea is to build a social movement that's capable of encompassing all the needs of workers. And as Josh said, you know, workers don't just work. They have other needs that are based on the family and based on, you know, taking care of the elderly, etc. A whole panoply of issues that are extremely important. And unions, I would argue, could do more. And some have done more, and I think that there's a need to, with all due respect to the union movement, that a lot of unions are paying lip service to the new program, the new Vice program in Washington under Sweeney, and there's a need for unions to really take tangible action. I mean, you have a lot of unions endorsing Republican candidates for specific reasons. You know, the Arctic Circle, you know, helps certain group of unions, the Teamsters, etc. Other workers will get goodies on another level. And I think the case of 1199 is another example of that. So if unions were to solidify, they might have a stronger voice.
One of the best examples, I guess, is union support for raising the minimum wage, which I guess has the ancillary effect of, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats. If you raise the minimum wage, then a union wage is going to go up. But you know, minimum wage workers, by and large, are not organized. If people want to come over and ask questions, I'd like to invite the students to do that. Talking about a labor party, I mean, you know, we are in a country which is traditionally among the least ideological in its political parties. I mean, I think the Republican Party has been captured more significantly by the right. I think that the Democratic Party has kind of shifted away from the left and more towards the center. It had a kind of a brief spasm of leftism, if you will. A labor party is, I mean, would a labor party work in this country, or is, I mean, organized labor is what, 17%, 15% of the workforce? I mean, it's a very small percentage compared to the larger workforce.
Well, I'm not a political scientist, but you know, one of the obstacles
TV,
is not just for a labor party, but for any third party, because the way we structure elections, we don't have proportional representation. There's very little in it for being a sort of third party. You don't get a share of power. It's hard to sort of build up. I mean, parties like the Green Party have tried, and they're making a tiny little bit of progress, but it's a tough.
They elected George Bush.
Well, that's true. They didn't elect their own candidate, though, and they didn't get a whole lot to build on out of that. So I think a labor party, like any other third party, has a very difficult set of obstacles in the very structure of American politics. I think there have been some parties like the Working Families Party here in New York that have tried to sort of dance back and forth between independence and alliance with the Democrats. But then here again, the structures don't work very well for that in most parts of the country. New York is very unique because you can cross-endorse candidates. But in most of the country, state labor election law doesn't allow that. So although on some level I could see Manny's point, I don't disagree with it, that it would be very different if we had such a party. It's hard to quite see a path that would get us there, you know, in any immediate future.
But even the Labour Party in Great Britain is hardly a Labour Party anymore. It's more of a kind of a traditional Democratic Party, if you will. It's like New Democrats in essence. Let me go to a question, please. Tell us your name, what campus you're from, please.
My name is Levi Goldman, and I attend Brooklyn College. This question is for Ms. Saru, that represents ROC. I believe you said earlier that labor unions should have the responsibility of galvanizing, in a sense, all the day laborers. How do you reconcile the fact that most day laborers are illegals in this country?
I take
At least
offense at
in
the
New
word
York.
illegal.
Yeah.
No human being is illegal.
No, but
People are
Undocumented, yeah.
undocumented.
Yeah.
They may not be working legally, but every resident, every worker in this country, by the federal labor laws and state labor laws, actually has rights to a minimum wage, to practically all the labor laws that we all enjoy except for unemployment benefits. Other than that, undocumented workers in this country actually have all the same rights and can be members of unions by federal law. So there's really no reason why unions should not be reaching out. In fact,
But doesn't it in fact make it more difficult to organize them? The fear that day laborers have. I mean, is there?
frankly, I've seen a lot of fear among U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens as well are workers who fear losing their jobs, and just, this country doesn't have a culture of organizing, honestly. And so a lot of U.S. citizens are equally afraid. We have organized hundreds of undocumented workers to win huge settlements against their employers, to win huge gains, to win improved working conditions, to go out on a limb. And they know that they have rights in this country.
Immigrant workers organize or have a propensity to organize more than native-born workers. I mean, that's exactly what the major unions that are organizing right now are targeting. Like I said earlier, custodial workers are being targeted by SEIU, restaurant and hotel workers are being targeted by HERE, Unite is targeting laundry workers, almost entirely immigrant workers. And one can go on and on. The construction industry is increasingly one that's made up of people from Central and South America. So the real question is, how come native-born workers aren't interested in organizing as much? Immigrants are the ones that are being targeted to a much larger extent, precisely because
Targeted by organizing campaigns.
by organizing campaigns, because they're interested.
And labor movements don't have a choice. 30% of the restaurant industry in New York City, more than 30%, is undocumented. If the restaurant union said, we're not going to organize undocumented workers, they'd be at a complete loss.
But if the rest is it correct to say that if the restaurant union was aggressively organizing those people with some success, groups like ROC wouldn't be as necessary?
No, I think both are necessary, because right now, Local 100, which is the food service workers union in New York City, has 1,500 restaurant workers. There are 165,000 restaurant workers in New York City. There's no way in any of our lifetimes they're going to organize this industry. And there are tons of really tiny workplaces that I've talked about that Local 100 would never dream of approaching. Never.
Well, in terms of day laborers, how much of a problem is it that you've got a transitory workforce, in the sense that in the old days, if you had a shape up on the docks, they were working at a particular pier, they were working on a particular ship, and so that you could catch them during a break, or you could catch them at some point on their jobs. That
Right.
here it's something, they get into a van, they're gone, and so
Right.
that. And if an employer approaches while a union organizer is talking to them, they're not going to stand there and continue listening to the organizer, and they're not
Well, I actually organized day laborers out in Long Island, and we had tremendous success. And the key here comes back to this issue of not thinking in this traditional way about workplaces, but thinking about an industry and how to build power for workers in an overall industry. If you think about day laborers, let's say on Long Island, every summer there are more than 1,000 day laborers on Long Island coming from all over Latin America. And, we organize these workers a lot of times. We would approach them early in the morning when they were waiting to get on the trucks. We would organize them. They had a center that they could come to. That was the key, that there was some place for them to gather. And frankly, day laborers are pretty easy to organize now, because a lot of them are living in groups, in houses. They live together. So
Just a follow-up to what Saru was saying, that New York State actually has one of the best laws with respect to back wages. And one of the key issues for immigrant workers is non-payment of wages or underpayment of wages and overtime, the National Labor Standards Act of 1938. And in New York State, the law is that if you're not paid back wages for 6 years, you are able to collect your wages and overtime. The national law is 2 years. So New York City actually has this environment that is much more, I would say, amenable to organizing immigrant workers, and a lot of organizations are picking up on this. In fact, Elliot Spitzer has established a code of conduct in the green grocer industry where, in fact, employers are required to pay back wages. There have been a lot of lawsuits. And I think actually New York does have this kind of culture of organizing that Josh talks about in his book that is still with us, at least in a residual way, that we think about. I mean, Republicans, we were talking about a period when we had a Republican Senate and a Republican Pataki in the governor's office that actually passed this law, supported by Long Island Republicans. So I think that's a really interesting...
I think it also, if I'm not mistaken, the law for the hiring hall, in particular in Farmingdale on Long Island, grew out of some horrendous racist attacks.
Yeah.
And there was a galvanizing of public opinion in response
People care.
to the, I think it was a firebombing of a house. And so, hopefully it takes something less than that to organize people. Yes, ma'am, ma'am, did you have a question?
My name is Ido Demo from York College. This question is directed towards Sarah. I wanted to ask you that so many undocumented immigrants are afraid of joining unions because of losing their job, being reported to the INS, and deporting back to their country. What can you assure them that this will not occur? Because there's so many working companies like nursing assistants. There's a lot of undocumented immigrants that are working for them but are afraid of going to unions and saying we need help. What can you assure them that this will not occur to them? How can you assure them?
Well, we're actually lucky in the New York region because there is an agreement between the New York's formerly INS division, which is now BICE, the Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Department of Labor. And the memorandum of understanding is that the formerly known as INS will not interfere in a labor dispute. So actually, we organize tons of undocumented workers. Every time we are about to organize a restaurant where we think there are undocumented workers working there, we actually send a letter to the former INS and say, look, we're about to be at the Park Avenue Country Club. According to your own internal operating standards, you cannot interfere. And the INS time after time sends us a letter saying, yes, we will not interfere in this labor dispute because it's according to our own internal operating agreement. And so we are actually able to guarantee to the undocumented workers working there that during the period of the labor dispute, they can't be touched by the INS, or the formerly known as INS. But, the thing is, ultimately, you can't guarantee anything to workers when you're organizing because there's always the threat of being fired. It's against the law, it's against the National Labor Relations Act to be fired for organizing, but the threat is always there. So, like I said, it's equally difficult to organize U.S. citizens as it is to organize immigrants. Sometimes, frankly, it's easier to organize immigrants because they come from countries where there's a very strong labor history and a very strong labor background and laws that are 20 times better than what we have in the United States. And so they're coming from this culture, they feel empowered, and they're able to organize better than a lot of times we find U.S. residents.
I think this connects to what Manny was talking about before, New York having a culture of organizing, because unions don't grow, I think, from scratch. And I think one of the things about New York is people grow up with some notion that there's this thing called unions, and maybe even a positive notion. I mean, after, for example, 9/11, there was a tremendous amount of respect for union workers in specific who pitched in. And of course, we have many immigrant workers who come from places with rich union traditions. What I think a lot of people in this part of the country don't realize is how regional union movement has been for a very long time. There are huge parts of this country, and they're the fast-growing parts of this country, where unions barely exist and haven't existed for 20, 30, 40 years.
And isn't the fact of right-to-work laws and weak union regulations, if any, a huge reason why those areas have grown?
I think that's a huge reason. I don't think it's the only reason, but I think that's a big part of it. There are cultures, there's long histories of opposing it. In the South, racism was such a critical piece of keeping out unions for many, many years.
It was a major factor here in the construction industry as well.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of reasons why, but what it means is as the country shifts southward and westward, we're shifting away from a union culture, which is really a regional culture of the Northeast and the the Middle Atlantic states and the Midwest and a little bit on the West Coast. But the rest of the country, what are you talking about? People have no idea what you're talking about.
But in fact, doesn't that also mirror the shift in the economy away from the manufacturing and industrial base to the service and technology sector, which is the question of the future of the union movement?
Yeah.
Can it adjust to this new economy And are we, happily living in some vestigial, wonderland that we, maybe it's nice that we don't know what's going on in the rest of the country.
Well, I think that one of the things that you have to consider is that there's a certain disconnect right now nationally between the economic indicators that show that the economy has bounced back and what people describe as a jobless recovery, where basically whatever those indicators are and however positive they're supposed to be, it's not reflected in terms of more people finding work. And there's a guy who I know who's retired, used to organize for the Ladies Garment Workers Union, and he had a line, "The bosses is the best organizers we got." And ultimately, it becomes a situation where what Josh was talking about before, whereas things get more prosperous, sometimes people feel more adventurous or more willing to put themselves at risk. If the economy starts to improve, where there's a little bit more economic security among workers in the South and in the West, they're liable to take a look at policies like Walmart, and they're likely to say to themselves, why is it that I'm getting so little in return for my labor? Why am I not getting a better life out of the fact that I'm working harder and my wife is working harder than our parents ever did in days when, for the most part, women were not working outside the home, and yet we're having a harder time getting by. And once they start thinking about that, if they get the chance to think about that, I think that you're going to have a lot more ferment and a lot more possibility that some of those people are going to be receptive to unions, that they're going to be a little bit less afraid and are going to figure that what have we got to lose, that we don't have that much right now to make it worth just keeping the status quo.
I'd just like to add to this. U.S. workers are more militant than virtually any other workforce in the country, except they express their militancy on the shop floor. I mean, perhaps not in the last several years because of the labor laws that are becoming increasingly difficult to overcome. Hoffman Plastics, by the way, really makes it difficult for immigrant workers to organize now, which basically says that if you're a leader in an immigrant organizing drive, you can be fired and not collect back wages. But
it's still illegal to be fired. You can't collect back wages from the time of firing to
right.
the.
But
it's
a
still
chilling
illegal.
effect. It's a totally chilling effect. But I think you have to go back to the labor laws. There was a recent study of 1998, Freeman and Rogers, that said that if everybody had a chance to organize in this country, you would have 40% union density, which represents 40% of all workers would be in unions. And those are primarily workers who are working low-wage jobs. So workers want unions. Workers, if you ask any worker, do you want to be in a union if your wages go up? You'll have all these benefits. You'll have weekends off, etc. I mean, I take that. I think anyone else would take that.
What kind of legal changes are we talking about?
Well, Josh referred to them. We don't have a right to organize in this country. And the AFL-CIO and the national unions know that. Basically, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, is ineffective in defending workers' rights to organize, primarily by delaying cases of organizing. They can go to impasse and implementation, which really means that even if you organize a shop, I don't know what the percentage is, I think something like 50 or 60% of all organized shops where workers not only sign cards, but a majority of them go to election, cannot get a contract. And once you don't get a contract, the employer can implement a contract. So we're really dealing under, one would argue, I know the FLCO is saying, these are human rights that the United States are violating, international ones that are codified by the ILO, International Labor Organization.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I still attend Brooklyn College, by the way. This question actually speaks very well to Professor Ness's last point. Representative Dick Gephardt, former House Minority Leader, was on a political show called Hardball with Chris Matthews, and he was posed with the question regarding a hypothetical arena, would he support national legislation that would require all workers to join labor unions? And I particularly want to ask the representative from ROC what she feels about that, and I think the question should be posed to the all of you that are sitting up there.
Workers would be required
that
to join
all
unions.
workers/laborers should be required to join labor unions. Every worker in America should be part of a labor union. Hypothetically.
I'm happy to take that on.
Okay.
In 1935, the United States Congress passed a law which seemed to me to have a very good principle, which basically was that every worker had a right to join a union, but it was only up to those workers in a particular workplace to decide for themselves whether they wanted to. And therefore, it does not mandate union membership. In fact, it would be illegal to force workers to join a union, but it gives the right of all workers to choose whether they want to belong to a union or not. It's a wonderful notion. The problem is, as Manny was saying, it really no longer exists as a practical right. So I think all we really need to do is get back to a principle that's already been on the books for almost 70 years. It's a different principle than the one you're describing. It's not mandatory union membership. It's the right to choose, the meaningful right to choose without the fear of reprisal, without the fear of loss of jobs.
I also think that that the mandatory aspect of that there was recently a law passed in a town in Kansas, which was also has similar laws. I think in Georgia, requiring people to have guns in their homes, and so it's I think that I think I'm not so trusting of my government that I'm into those kinds of mandates and telling me how to live. Even though obviously I have been in a number of unions and grew up in a union household, and I believe and lived in housing that was built in part. Well, it was built by union labor and built because of union agitation to build housing. So, I have been the beneficiary of unions, but I'm not sure about the mandatory aspect of it.
Part of the problem is workers don't have a lot of choices among the unions that currently exist. For restaurant workers, there's really only one food service workers union, and if you don't like it, you're screwed. So I think that it wouldn't work partly because there just isn't the diversity of union choices for workers right now.
But then the question becomes, why doesn't that union work for its members? I mean, one of the problems that you get into when you talk about unions is the way that the culture has spread itself out so that you no longer have an employee group living within the same neighborhood or living within the same borough the way that you did in New York City once upon a time, that the further away people get, the more time they have to spend commuting and the more time that they're spending on family life and life away from the job, that in essence, the labor movement eats itself a little bit, because the more leisure time you give workers, the more they're going to enjoy that time away from the office, the less they're going to want to come to union meetings and get themselves involved. The less involved a union membership is, the more likelihood there is that the bosses or the labor leaders are going to be making bad deals, are going to be looking out more for themselves and for their perks than they are for their members. And it's one of those things, you could call it the evil genius of American capitalism, that you will never have an ideal labor movement simply because there are too many things pulling people away from being involved in their unions. But I'm not sure just how you get around that. But Josh's point, I think, is a valid one, that if you had the option, why wouldn't you want to join a union? Why wouldn't you want the opportunity to buttress your wages, to get a better life for yourself? The fact that the baseball players union, which, if anything, was ever an example of independent contractors, they would seem to be it. But you look at how wages have skyrocketed, you look at them compared to 30 years ago, it's in another stratosphere. And that's a bunch of people who you would figure wouldn't want to agree on anything, who are regimented somewhat from the time that they're young, playing on baseball teams, and you would think would be less likely to engage in collective action. You look at the benefits that have come to them as a result of that, and you just say to yourself, well, that's the extreme example, but for anybody, you should be able to make a better life for yourself if you've got a working union that's working in your best interests.
The interesting question is, at least in terms of traditional unions, I think it's a very interesting point. Have they become so successful that they're damaged by it?
I don't know where you're getting this idea that people have more leisure time. Juliet Schor wrote this amazing book called The Overworked American. Juliet Schor was a Harvard economist, which basically proved that people have less leisure time now than serfs did in feudal times, and that since the 30s, and really the 50s was the peak of leisure time in the United States. Since that time, our leisure time has dwindled to less than zero. And workers are working 2-3 jobs just to survive. Most of the workers I work with.
But in most cases, they are using cars. They are not living right near where their office is, and so that they are spending more, whether it's in pursuits that they think are ideal or whether it's riding the number 6 train from the Bronx downtown, that you've got a different model in New York City than you did once upon a time in terms of people basically not really leaving the workplace to a great extent, of maybe living 6 or 8 blocks away, and you chose the place you lived in part because it was close to your job. That now people will endure these frightful commutes. It's the reason that the Long Island Expressway is congested the way it is, when it would seem like it would make a lot more sense either to be working closer to home or to be using mass transit. But people have the ability to get in their cars, which become kind of cocoons for them. You've got your stereo system that you can play where...
Yeah, I think that's definitely a certain class of people. I mean,
But it's
I-
a significant class of people. I mean, you know, there's a significant union force that is a middle class force. I mean, you're dealing a lot with people who are marginalized in this economy, and you're trying to bring them in from being marginalized in the economy.
Yeah, but
the success of the labor movement in its growth after World War II is totally linked to suburbanization, to the creation of the Levittowns of the world, and to the increasing population in the suburbs.
I mean, I just think that's a much smaller percentage of New York than you do. I think the kinds of workers I'm talking about are by far the fastest growing, segment of the economy in New York City.
Why don't we think of it as this way, that people working 3 or 4 jobs, they're disconnected from each of those jobs. So they don't really know who their union is, they don't know the workplace environment, so they're kind of atomized in some way. A lot of native-born workers, but immigrants as well. So you don't develop those really thick connections at the workplace.
But that's precisely
the
why we
problem.
have to think beyond the workplace.
Yes.
We have to think about an industry. We have to think about a center. We have to think about a movement. If traditional unions don't keep that word movement in the labor movement, which they don't have right now, they're going to fail, which they, frankly, right now are doing.
It seems that we're looking at 2 different aspects of the labor movement. It seems to me that a lot of the industrial unions, a lot of the construction unions have in fact had great success for their members. And it's partly a desire, I think, for the new workers to emulate that kind of success, to grab their piece of the pie, in essence.
Well, I think, when you talk about industrial unions, though, first of all, manufacturing itself has declined at an incredibly rapid rate. I mean, I don't think people realize that. I think something like 17% of all manufacturing jobs have disappeared over the last 3 years in the United States. This is an astounding decline. So if you don't have a job, being a union member is less of a consolation. And the other thing is that the movement of jobs out of unionized areas of the country or out of the country entirely puts tremendous downward pressure. So I certainly agree that this is a tremendous accomplishment, but I don't know if it's still sustained.
Well, I want to thank everybody. I've gotten the goodbye sign, which I'm notoriously bad about meeting, and I want to thank everybody for being here, but I do obey, and I'm a good union man. And thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next time on the CUNY Forum.